moderate, and Dr. Viet Nam, who is our host for the first live commentary, as the caretaker. So please take it away.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody, and a very early morning to some of the speakers, I guess. Thank you very much for joining us. In this session, we will hear different perspectives on the taunting question or daunting question, whether or not we are in the upshot to another Cold War. Every speaker in this session has a unique understanding of the perspectives, motives, and ambitions of international, regional, and national stakeholders that are part of the global landscape, the multilateral system, and the Indo-Pacific and the South China Sea in particular. They will share with us their insights on potential frictions, and they will suggest instruments to prevent or resolve them. Thus, they will help us better understand how to manage a situation that is potentially cold, turning to potentially hot. I would like to thank the Diplomatic Academy for your leadership in addressing this very complex issue. I think it's exemplary for the constructive and proactive role that Vietnam is taking in this issue of interest of so many. Before giving the floor to the first speaker, allow me to remind both speakers and members of the audience that we only have 1.5 hours for a topic on which we could dialogue days. And that as your moderator, I also have the ungrateful task to be your time manager as well. So please forgive me in advance. So with further ado, and not entirely according to the paper program that is in front of you, I would like to first give the floor to Ambassador Bilahari Kausikan, former permanent secretary of the Singaporean Ministry of Foreign Affairs and chairman of the Middle East Institute of the National University of Singapore. Mr. Kausikan, you will reflect on some scenarios involving the South China Sea to illustrate that the US-China competition is not a Cold War, but far from easy. The floor is yours.
Thank you. First of all, let me apologize because I have to leave at, say, 12:10 sharp for another appointment. So I'll be very brief and direct to the point. I think we are undoubtedly in a phase of intense US-China competition. I do not think that the recent virtual summit between President Biden and President Xi is going to fundamentally change the trajectory of US-China relations. What they said is what one expects them to say at the first meeting, and it's entirely unrealistic to think that one summit meeting will fundamentally change things. Although we are certainly in a phase of intense competition between US and China, I think it is wrong to characterize this, as so many people have unfortunately done so, as a new Cold War. It is not a new Cold War, and to use the trope of a new Cold War to describe US-China competition is intellectually lazy and in fact misleading. Why do I say this? If you cast your mind back to the period of US-Soviet competition, you will see it is fundamentally different. The US and the Soviet Union led two different systems, and their competition was to see which system would prevail. By contrast, the US and China are both vital, irreplaceable components of a single system, connected to each other and to other parts of this system, other economies of this single global system, by supply chains of a density, of a complexity, and of a scope that is unprecedented in history. Supply chains of this nature have never before existed. And this is a fundamental difference. They compete within this single system to see who will dominate it. Competition between systems is not the same as competition within a system. And that is why the trope of a new Cold War is inappropriate. It doesn't mean that competition is any less intense, but it is much more complex. Let me give you two quick examples. to illustrate the complexity. I think we all know that semiconductors have emerged as a serious Chinese vulnerability. The Chinese have been trying to build and manufacture high-end semiconductors for quite a long time, but without any appreciable success so far. And I think it's going to be very difficult for them to do so, because the semiconductor supply chain is one of the most complex supply chains that exists. And very vital nodes in this supply chain, certain kinds of machine tools, certain kinds of materials are held by the US or its allies. Our moderator is from Holland, and the Netherlands certainly controls one of a very vital node in this semiconductor supply chain, without which it is practically impossible to manufacture high-end semiconductors. At the same time, I think we should note that China is about 40% of the world semiconductor market. And it is not possible for the US, much as it may like to do so, to cut off its own companies and the companies of its friends and allies from 40% of a world market without doing grievous damage to its own companies or the companies of its friends and allies. So I think you see the complication. So the complexity of the relationship between the US and China is both an instrument of competition and in a way conditions and limits that competition, or makes it at least more complicated. Let me give you an example related directly to the South China Sea. China often says that it is not interfering with freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. That is a rather disingenuous argument, because there is a fundamental difference between freedom of navigation enjoyed by all as a right enshrined in international law and freedom of navigation conferred as a favor or by a major power. But it is nonetheless not entirely wrong, in the sense that I don't think China has, at least not to my knowledge, interfered with merchant traffic. The pressures it has deployed in the South China Sea are certainly against the weaker powers, the weaker claimant states, and dangerous incidents between the US and China have been rather infrequent. And I think this is the reason for this is quite obvious, because China is dependent on those trade routes, and if it were to get into a confrontation over those trade routes with a major power like the United States, it will hurt itself as well as other countries. Now, I don't think that war by design between the US and China is very likely. Of course, in any system of sovereign states, you can never discount the possibility of competition turning into conflict. But I stress the point, war by design. In other words, war or conflict as an instrument of policy. Insofar as China has been provocative, it has been against weaker states. And as I said, dangerous incidents involving the US and China have been, to my mind, rather infrequent. I doubt, of course, accidents can always happen. And when I think President Biden and Secretary of State Blinken talked about putting guardrails on the competition, that is what they meant, to try to lower the probability of accidents. I think actually, if accidents should happen, both sides will try their best to try and contain accidents. The danger of conflict is not between the US and China in the South China Sea, but between China and the claimant states, all of which are weaker than China. I'll end here and turn it over to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Kausikan, for these very interesting insights. Bearing in mind that you will have to leave before this, the panelist sessions and interventions, and if there are any questions for Mr. Kausikan, please let us know, and we will try to accommodate them in between the upcoming presentations. So having said that, let me please turn to Dr. Zac Cooper, Senior Fellow of the American Enterprise Institute. Sir, it must be pretty early for you. I understood that you will reflect on the drivers of current international relations and how they may play out in topical or interstate coalitions. The floor is yours.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. It's great to be here with all of you. I wish I could be there in person. And like Bill Hari, unfortunately, I have a hard stop at about 12:10, 12:15. So I'll be very brief. But what I want to talk through is actually something very similar to what Bill Hari said, which is I don't think the Cold War is a good comparison for what's happening right now with the US and China. And let me build on what he said by arguing that actually, if you look back at the Cold War, especially the Cold War that many Americans think about in Europe, there are huge differences between the current competition we have between the US and China and the old US-Soviet competition. And so let me just lay out a couple of those and explain why I think they're important and why we shouldn't use the Cold War analogy. So first, if you think about the Cold War in Europe, you had two competing blocs, and those blocs were very similar within each one of them. So obviously you had NATO and the Warsaw Pact. NATO tended to be democratic. The Warsaw Pact tended to be socialist or communist. They had two totally different political and economic systems, therefore, and they were differentiated by the blocs that they were in. They also had two very different geographic boundaries, right? They were literally divided by the Iron Curtain, and each of the blocs was worried together about one major military threat. So for NATO, that was an invasion by the Warsaw Pact and the Soviets through the inter-German border. And this motivated not just West Germany, not just France, it motivated the entire NATO alliance. If you look at Asia today, you don't see any of these kinds of similarities. Many of the countries that the US shares many interests with are not democratic. Many of them are not fully capitalist. And almost none of them share the same geographic concerns. So if you think about the countries the US talks about partnering with most often in East Asia, you've got Japan, which is worried most about the East China Sea, South Korea, which is worried most about the Korean Peninsula, Taiwan, which is worried most about the Taiwan Strait, Viet Nam, which is worried most about South China Sea issues, especially related to the paracels. The Philippines worried most about issues like Scarborough Shoal and the Spratlys. And you can go all the way around to India, which is worried most about its border in the Himalayas. These are totally different geographic concerns, and with countries that have very different political and economic systems. So unlike the Cold War, where you had two relatively cohesive blocs in the European arena, you're not going to get anything like that in Asia over the next few decades. In fact, what I've argued and what I'll just talk about briefly here is that I think you're going to see different coalitions emerge on different issue sets. And I think there are at least four. The four I have in mind are security, economics, technology, and global governance. And I think if you think about how those four lay down over the South China Sea, you'll see that on the South China Sea is absolutely critical on security issues, on economic issues, and on the rules of the road for global governance. So it hits three of the four coalitions. But that doesn't mean that it's easy to build these coalitions. And I think this is where what Bill Hari said is so important. In many ways, this is a much, much more complex system than the one that existed during the Cold War. And I think many Americans, when we default back to this Cold War terminology, we actually oversimplify the current competition, because it's going to be impossible to think about countries aligning in every one of these areas with either the United States or with China. Very few countries are going to do that, maybe only a handful. Most countries are going to be aligned on certain issues and not on others. And when the United States pushes too hard for alignment on all of them, as I think we sometimes have, we're going to see some pretty severe pushback, even from our friends. And so I think what's so challenging about this new dynamic is that many Americans come to this with a Cold War construct, because that's what so much of our history and strategic thought has come out of. But in fact, the new era we're entering is entirely different. And it's one in which we have to be much more flexible and much more nimble. And this requires exceptionally careful policymaking. And I don't think I'm going to shock anyone in the room there by saying that American policymakers are not always exceptionally careful in how they speak and act in the region. And even if we were, this would still be incredibly difficult. So I think when we talk about this Cold War landscape in that way, it actually oversimplifies the challenge that we have, which is much more complex than I think we tend to appreciate. And because time is short, let me just say one more thing, which is the challenge now for the Biden team, I think, is to prioritize not country by country, but actually country by country and coalition by coalition. So does the United States need country X in coalition Y? That is a really hard problem. So, sometimes friends in Southeast Asia say that they don't want to be forced to choose. And I think the United States is going to have to make sure that Southeast Asian friends and others don't feel forced to choose. But when countries have already made a choice, the United States is going to have to do everything it can to get those countries on board with reinforcing the rules that we want to see in the security arena, in the economic arena, in the technology arena, and on global governance. If we can do that, then I think the US is in a very strong position to uphold the parts of the order that are most important and consequential, and in fact, potentially to convince China to moderate its behavior. If the US can't do that, if it can't build these coalitions, I think this is going to be incredibly difficult. And too often the United States has approached this in an overly unilateral manner. So let me hand it back and just be very brief, but looking forward to the discussion from everyone here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Cooper. And it seems that of the 5 speakers that we have, there are now 2 that tend to say a hard no to the question that is at the base of this session. And thank you very much for pointing out that we should never, ever in international relations simplify situations that are complex by nature. Let's see if our next speaker, Dr. Anna Kureva, who is attached to the Department of African and Asia Studies of the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, shares the perspective of the former 2 speakers. Mrs. Kureva, I understand that you will touch upon competing visions for the regional order in the Indo-Pacific, and you will focus especially on Russia's position, and that might, let's say, in the light of the base question of this session, be a very interesting starting point. So thank you, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. That's a great honor for me to be here. For sure, I do agree with the previous speakers that we are not witnessing anything like a Cold War. And I also find it quite misleading to name it this way. And of course, despite a number of attempts by Trump administration to initiate a kind of decoupling from China, it's more likely that we witness a kind of targeted decoupling in specific issue areas that can be regarded as a security concern. They could include telecommunication, artificial intelligence, big data, biotech, and maybe the areas which have been highlighted by COVID-19 pandemic, such as pharmaceutical industry, but it seems really not likely that we are going to witness any real major decoupling that will be somehow reminiscent of the Cold War as well. So as far as competing visions are concerned, it's quite clear that we do have a number of competing visions for the regional order, and probably the first one I would like to touch upon is represented by a China-centric order. And here the Belt and Road Initiative and the Community of Common Destiny for Mankind as a kind of its ideological framework serves clearly a number of economic and geopolitical goals, and probably a final result would be, of course, kind of co-development and joint investment and a lot of cooperation, but also it has been designed to put China at the dominant position in the regional order and restructure the order according to its preferences, including including the security aspects, the political aspects, and economic aspects, such as value chains as well. And we can see that asymmetrical economic interdependence that emerges as a result of China's massive investment actually provides China with a huge leverage to at least to make other countries more willing to support its foreign policy and core interests, especially if the countries want to continue receiving the public goods that are provided by China. Clearly, we have alternative visions, and the free and open Indo-Pacific could be considered as such. There are many ideas behind that, but probably we could reflect on the growing interconnectedness of the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, and also the idea, the goal to prevent China from acquiring dominant positions in this particular region. However, we could point out that there are different versions of the Indo-Pacific, clearly, and there is a number of common principles. Most of the countries who envision its share, such as freedom of navigation, overflight, and also probably most states share, or at least favor that the American presence in the region is one of the means to provide a deterrence vis-a-vis China. However, we can clearly see that there are differences between Indo-Pacific strategies and visions for the Indo-Pacific between among different states in the region. So we don't have here a kind of a coherent notion, but there is a number of principles, and it's kind of clear that there are more inclusive versions and less inclusive versions of the Indo-Pacific. As has already been mentioned, regional powers really wouldn't like to choose between the US and China, and Russia would also be the one that wouldn't really like to form a kind of a full-fledged military alliance with China. However, we could say that hedging strategies that used to serve quite well to many of the regional states, they have become increasingly challenged with the rise of US-China strategic competition, and it has become much more difficult to use them. Probably we could describe the regional order as polycentric because there are different centers of power. They are not equal in terms of their capabilities. Also as multiplex, also in many ways pluralistic, but at the same time, the order is being contested. And although US and China undoubtedly constitute two major centers of power, there is also a number of other major powers and middle powers, which are more or less aligned with some of these powers. But at the same time, even the American allies, and especially non-American allies, they are also aware that they should play their own roles and also have slightly or even more clearly articulated different versions of the Indo-Pacific from the American one. And especially India, although it has developed kind of a profound alignment with the US and Japan, it seems not to be ready to become a full-fledged ally of the United States. And also, we do have middle powers. Of course, Japan would be one of the major powers here. Also, middle powers such as South Korea, Australia, Indonesia have their own perspectives on the Indo-Pacific, and also emerging middle powers such as Viet Nam, which actually adds to the complexity of this regional order. And the relationship between the states, among the states of the region, could be said to be represented by alliances, alignments, and loose coalitions. These kind of alignments and coalitions, they have been subject to different changes as a consequence of regional dynamics and domestic politics, and probably we are going to see it more or less this way. Such alignments as the Quad and AUKUS also characterize kind of a flexible and issue-based partnerships that are concentrated around a number of common goals and principles. And these dynamics on the one hand make the order contested and thus kind of unstable or not that stable. But on the other hand, it allows for more flexibility, more freedom for maneuver, and greater autonomy for foreign policy decision-making of many of regional states. And here, I think Russia's position is in many ways similar to other major powers, but it's also quite unique. On the one hand, Russia is a great power on the global scale due to its military capabilities. However, in terms of economic and technological power, it clearly falls short of both the United States and China. Geographically, 2/3 of Russia's territory belong to Asia, and Russia is also a Northern Pacific power, which makes Russia one of the regional players as well. However, Russia's actual presence and involvement in the Indo-Pacific is kind of limited. It falls short of being a formidable economic actor here in the region. For a long time, Russia's policy in the region remained kind of multi-vector or diversified, while strengthening relations with China. Russia at the same time wanted to maintain close relations with other states such as India, Japan, also South Korea. And Russia has always supported the central role of ASEAN and ASEAN centrality. And for a long time, Russia was trying to avoid conflict with the United States in Asia. We can clearly see that Russia's relations with China represent a deeper alignment in the form of strategic partnership, and there is a number of goals that the two share. Of course, a crisis in the relationship between Russia and the United States, and also heightened strategic competition between the US and China, overall prompted the two states to heighten their military cooperation, to take more steps to improve interoperability and broaden cooperation in the strategic sphere. At the same time, Russia and China are not clearly going or ready to enter a full-fledged alliance with security guarantees, as it will hamper their autonomous decision-making. And Russia doesn't really think it's necessary to comply with China's policies in Asia. It retains strategic neutrality in territorial disputes, including the South China Sea. And Russia also values very much its security partnerships with such countries as India and Viet Nam, especially, which are considered very valuable strategic partners. So it is not really going to sacrifice its national interests for the sake of China's. Russia would also like to see the regional order polycentric and not really dominated by any of the major powers. So if we ask why this so, it is because Russia also wants to be one of the centers of power, although in terms of its capabilities in the region, it clearly falls behind other major powers. We can say at the same time that Russia's own strategy has recently been concentrated more on the continental space, the Eurasian space, rather than the maritime one, with this idea of the Greater Eurasian Partnership. And the last point, in order for the escalation of the regional conflicts not to spin out of control, it seems that it's very important to prevent a downslide to kind of a rigid bipolar order that will leave the states no other option than to choose a side, to pick up it very clearly. So it seems that supporting connections and loose coalitions between the powers that would like to see inclusive in the Pacific could be a step in the right direction. Even if the states cannot really agree upon the rules of the game, at least discussing principles and norms guiding the regional order should be very important. And supporting multilateral institutions, especially the ASEAN-centric one, is also one of the ways forward here. The last thing, I think that Russia has clearly the potential to play a role here with its capabilities in terms of maritime security and also non-traditional security threats, and could serve a kind of a bridge to connect the Indo-Pacific with the Arctic and Eurasia. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. That was really very insightful, and I applaud you for almost keeping it within the 10 minutes. It's probably so that you will receive a number of questions, and thank you very much for highlighting, let's say, the Russian perspective of this relation of competition that we see from a global perspective and also in this region. Let me move on to the next speaker in our esteemed panel, Dr. Sushan Liu, postdoctoral fellow of the Brookings Institution, where she focuses her research on Chinese foreign policy, especially crisis behavior and decision-making, maritime security in the Indo-Pacific, and the United States relationship with Asia. Dr. Liu, you will, in your address, focus on the role of ASEAN, and the floor is now yours.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Thank you for inviting me. It's a great honor to be on this panel with other distinguished co-panelists. Let me share my screen. So can everyone see the screen? Okay, good.
Yes, we can see it.
I will build on the insights of my co-panelists in concurring that there are a lot of countries that do not closely or perfectly align with want to choose sides between the United States and China. So here I would chime in from perspective of build back the buffer by empowering ASEAN, which is with buttressing from other middle players to prevent hot conflict and Cold War. So like many of have already been noted by my co-panelists and other distinguished speakers that ASEAN is currently facing the growing U.S.-China strategic competition. It is facing emerging risk of split or even polarization, which in turn could profoundly undermine the institution's traditional role as a geopolitical buffer, because one major lesson that Southeast Asian countries has learned from the Cold War is the split of the region between two blocs, the communist and non-communist blocs. During the Cold War, and also a proxy war was fought on the soil of Viet Nam. So in the post-war era, ASEAN has built its strategy. In the post-Cold War era, ASEAN has built its strategy surrounding the so-called this very well-known hedging strategy, or enmeshing, or double binding, or soft balancing, where and such a strategy has really achieved remarkable success in bringing stability and the development to the region, and also won ASEAN the reputation as a middleman, a honest broker, a bridge between the great powers and the geopolitical buffer. But nowadays, as the keynote speech I cited here delivered by Singapore's Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong at the 2019 Shangri-La Dialogue, ASEAN is facing a crisis, institutional crisis that it might be pushed to choose sides between two major powers, but for smaller countries, it doesn't want to be pressured into choose sides. So I think that brings to a question of ASEAN is facing a daunting task to rebuild and reinforce its role as the geostrategic buffer and amidst the growing competition between the United States and China. And also, I would argue that the best way for ASEAN to help, that's also the best way for ASEAN to help mitigate the growing U.S.-China tensions and prevent hot conflict and new Cold War in the region. Since a lot have been said on the internal side that ASEAN need to strengthen its institutional cohesiveness, unity, and maintain the principle of consensus-built decision-making at a time when consensus and collective neutrality becomes even more difficult to secure. I think I'll address briefly on more on the external side, which will comprise of a multi-pronged approach. On the one hand, in managing its relations with two major powers, the United States and China, ASEAN need to continue to leverage its relations and influence with both countries. And as one of the panelists from the first panel mentioned, ASEAN does enjoy this normative power. And at the same time, ASEAN needs to rally support from other middle players that do share ASEAN's worries and objective of not being pressured into choosing side. So first, in dealing with the two major powers, in terms of dealing with China, on one hand, I think Mr. Derek Grossman mentioned the two incidents, the 2012 Scarborough Shoal standoff and 2014 HD 981 incidents. Actually, a comparison of the two cases shows that China's past behavior really demonstrates that Beijing cares as much about its image of non-belligerency as its reputation, as well as its reputation for itself. And in South China Sea, when Chinese actions are resisted by a concerted ASEAN ASEAN effort as we've seen back in 2014, which contrasts the case back in 2012. That ASEAN quickly put out a joint statement expressing its great concern about what was happening in the paracels. Beijing would more likely to modulate its behavior. And according to my conversation with Chinese interlocutors when conducting my research, in the words of one of Chinese interlocutors, that ASEAN has long been a showcase of China's neighborly diplomacy and intention to rise peacefully. So once ASEAN begins to openly criticize China, China will really lose its moral high ground. So ASEAN does enjoy this moral normative leverage vis-a-vis China, and it needs to continue to meet Chinese oversteps with unity and thereby maintain an effective reputational deterrence. At the same time, I think the ASEAN need to communicate clearly to Beijing when Chinese assertive behavior has helped squander opportunities for relation reparations and provoke Southeast Asian countries to lean further toward the United States. And I think this becomes even more important nowadays for ASEAN to fill this void in issuing such kind of wake-up calls to Beijing, or such kind of warning to Beijing, as it seems that analysts in China are becoming increasingly more reluctant to speak out against Beijing's often self-defeating foreign policy actions, and also criticism from the U.S. side are often viewed with suspicion. So I think that puts ASEAN in a good position to fill this void and issue and warning. Just like people, if you hear criticism from someone you detest, you might not want to take it and view with suspicion. But if it comes from someone that you view as a friend, you might want to take it more seriously. And also, and on the other hand, in ASEAN dealing with the United States, I think ASEAN needs to make clear to Washington that America's pressure for pressuring or treating Southeast Asian countries as instruments or derivatives of competition with China would be met with resistance or even pushback. And since that the 2019 ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific comes as a response and pushback of ASEAN to the US Indo-Pacific strategy came out just 2 weeks before the ASEAN version, ASEAN released its version. And also ASEAN need to encourage the US-led regional groupings like Quad to go beyond the security and military-centric approach and shift toward a greater role in providing public goods and provide attractive alternative to China's economic influence in the region, as already discussed by quite a few of the panelists. And here I would like to toss out some initial steps for tension and risk reduction that ASEAN can try to broker right now. Because as we talk about the principled positions and more strategic grand strategic issues, I think more actionable policy options need to be tossed out there. I think for ASEAN, it can try to broker a deal, but on one hand, encourage China to make a pledge of not pledging China to
Dr. Liu, I'm going to advise you that you still have 2 minutes to finalize your presentation. I'm sorry.
I'll wrap up. Okay, I think China can, ASEAN can encourage China to make a pledge of not declaring a South China Sea ADIZ, a pledge of not conducting extra land reclamation and not fielding additional military assets to its land features in Spratly, a pledge of respecting the freedom of navigation for foreign military vessels. And for the United States, I think ASEAN need to encourage it to substantially reduce the FONOPS while making a pledge of not fielding in intermediate range missiles to the first island chain. And these measures does not require, assumes the region will operate under the in the circumstance of trust deficit, but the Biden-Xi virtual summit will open up some transit, a feasible window opportunity. And also none of the commitment is irreversible. So if one side cheat, the other side can almost immediately resume part of or all of the actions. And ASEAN also enjoys, presumably, the strength in numbers and the moral high grounds for being the weaker or the normative power. And these steps can also be the building blocks toward negotiations on strategic issues such as demilitarizing, land features, and arms control to be worked out later. I think for middle players, a lot has already been discussed. I think ASEAN need to work with Japan, Australia, EU, and as well as other middle powers. But there's one challenge for ASEAN is to convince these players to balance their multilateral approach that seeks to deter China through security coalitions with multilateral diplomacy intended to increase region resilience and prevent conflict. So I'll stop here. Just look forward to further exchange and discussion in the Q&A.
Thank you, Dr. Liu, and I'm terribly sorry for cutting you short, but there will be a Q&A session afterwards in which we can absolutely continue to discuss about all the good advice that you gave to ASEAN in both its internal as well as external relations and future engagements. Bearing in mind that Ambassador Kausikan is in a time squeeze, I have a question that he might answer before he needs to step out. It's a question of Chin. Last year, Ambassador Kausikan, you said Southeast Asian countries needed to consider revoking ASEAN membership for Cambodia and Laos for allowing an external power to exert influence on them, a thinly veiled reference to their proximity to China. Do you still keep this idea? Ambassador? I think the ambassador has already left. Well, okay, so we'll find another way of posing this question to him. And then without further ado, let me introduce to you the fifth speaker of this panel, Dr. Sang-Hyun Lee, president of the Sejong Institute in Korea. As I understood, Mr. Lee will reflect on defining factors for the global security landscape, US-China strategic competition, and the way that plays out in the Indo-Pacific, as well as mechanisms to mitigate tensions, manage crises, and engage in tackling global challenges. Mr. Lee, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Kaman, and I appreciate Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam for inviting me for this excellent panel. So I'm pretty much in line with the previous commentators that current situation may not exactly be the same as Cold War that we have witnessed in the 20th century. So many speakers already mentioned that US-China is engaged in really serious strategic competition. But I agree that current situation may be much more complex and complicated. But as a regional country, South Korea, I would like to emphasize the point that South Korea feels the impact of US-China competition more seriously. As we know, South Korea is a US ally, but has also a very close economic relationship with China. So if this US-China strategic competition continues in the long time in the future, perhaps South Korea and many other countries that maintains a relationship both US and China may be quite difficult. So we see serious US-China strategic competition. And on top of that, there are more factors that make the current global situation much more complicated. First of all, we have COVID-19, more than 5 million people already have died so far. And global economy is not yet fully recovered. And also we see missing global leadership. So I would say that combined effect of all these phenomena is a kind of a systemic fragmentation. Means that current global order is not functioning properly. So with that background, US and China are now engaged in a full strategic competition. You know that we know that U.S.-China trade competition started with the trade war, but these days U.S.-China is competing in almost every front: values, systems, ideology, everything. And in that competition, Indo-Pacific is emerging as a center of global politics, and it is becoming an increasingly important region of the world. So in other words, Indo-Pacific is a main competing ground between, for example, US Indo-Pacific strategy versus China's Belt and Road Initiative. And even we see a Quad plus, and even AUKUS on one side, and China's expanding maritime assertiveness in other sides. And looking at this progress in Indo-Pacific and US-China strategic competition, South Korea is trying to maintain its strategic reaction to this recent development. For example, South Korea's new Southern policy has a close connection with the Indo-Pacific strategy. And in the ROC US summit held in May, both Korea and the United States confirmed that Korea supports ASEAN centrality and ASEAN-led regional architecture. And South Korea agreed to expand the regional coordination on law enforcement, cybersecurity, public health, and promoting a green recovery. And also South Korea explicitly mentioned that we will oppose all activities that undermine or destabilize or threaten the rule-based international order, and commit to maintain an inclusive, free, and open Indo-Pacific. So South Korea pledged to maintain peace and stability, lawful, unimpeded commerce, and respect for international law, including freedom of navigation and overflight in the South China Sea and beyond. So having said that, already many people, many experts are concerned that whether or not this US-China strategic competition may develop into a new Cold War. And as I have said in the beginning, current situation is much more complex, but if we believe US-China continues this strategic competition far longer from now on, perhaps we cannot guarantee the possibility that it will develop into a new Cold War. So then how can we prevent a Cold War turn into a hot one? I would like to point out 3 points. First, it seems to me we need more and more center of gravity besides the US and China in international politics. We can characterize the Cold War was a systematic confrontation between the two hostile camps. So to avoid the recurrence of the Cold War, the world must be prevented from being divided into two hostile camps, which means that we have a third, fourth center of gravity in international politics beside the US and China. Which means that we need a little more multipolar system, which is more needed for the time being than the bipolar system. And in that sense, it is quite important for middle power countries, including ASEAN, to form a third power to buffer the tension in the competition between great powers. Second point, of course, regional stability and security is important. So I would urge US and China has to talk about a crisis management mechanism or sort of a de-escalation procedure. Ideally, US and China should agree to pledge to not unilaterally alter the status quo in Taiwan or South China Sea, and both need more communication channels and mechanisms to avoid conflict, especially in the South China Sea. In these components, already many people indicated that we need a code of conduct. Luckily, in the US-China summit, both countries agreed to the importance of strategic stability among two countries. But I would say that that kind of mechanism, crisis management or de-escalation mechanism, should be expanded to the Indo-Pacific region. And the third point is that then what should we do? Collaborating to fight against the greatest risk of our times. I'll say with many C's: COVID-19, China, carbon, even cybersecurity. So we should expand cooperation in non-traditional security area, such as digital connectivity, trade and economic regional architecture, and also many other issues in Indo-Pacific region. So in that, if we make progress on these issues, perhaps we can avoid current US-China strategic competition develop into a new Cold War. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lee. That was very interesting. And with that last remark, I see that you have answered one of the questions that was posed online by Leduc Ang, where he referred how can global challenges like COVID-19 influence the current relationship between competing blocs. He's referring to a new Cold War, but I think that almost all speakers underlined that we don't talk about a new Cold War, but something different, more complex, more multi-layered than the Cold War as we know it from before. We have a number of speakers who are in a time frame, and I would love to do them justice, as I would like to do you justice. So Mr. Cooper is in a time squeeze, as is Mr. Lee. No questions for them online. If there are questions from the room for either of those two esteemed speakers, I would like to ask you to raise your hand, identify yourself, and pose your question. And please do not be shy, because I think the topics that were handled in this session are interesting enough and elaborated upon enough to be straightforward. Yes, Dr. Sun, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And I'd like to pose a question to Dr. Cooper. You talked at length about how different it is, these episodes of geopolitical competitions to the previous Cold War. I wonder if you see similarities, features as well. The arms race, the push and pull of geopolitics. What else do you see as similarities in this geopolitical competition to the previous Cold War that we need to be mindful about? Thank you.
Well, it's a great question. So I do think there are similarities. I do think there are things that we can learn from the Cold War, but we just have to be mindful as we do it that there are real differences as well. So let me just lay out a couple quickly. So one is that if you think about the military balance, look, there's an incredible amount of focus here in Washington on one specific scenario increasingly, which is a crisis over the Taiwan Strait. And that's something similar to the Cold War, right? If you think about the time and effort the United States put in to working with NATO, thinking about an invasion through the Fulda Gap of Western Europe, that really motivated the United States and its allies and partners in that case. And I think we're seeing the United States consolidate around a Taiwan scenario being the most concerning challenge. And just like in that case, the United States had to make some very difficult decisions about where it was going to put its priorities. How much of its resources was it going to devote to Europe? How much was it going to devote in the Middle East, in Asia and elsewhere? And I think we're seeing those same kinds of tensions emerge now. What's really different, however, is that a Taiwan crisis, as I said at the outset, is really not going to involve that many countries, most likely. You know, I've written a bit about the fact that I think if there was an invasion of Taiwan by China, the United States would probably take action, Japan might, and that might be about it. Very different than the kind of scenarios we talked about in the Cold War. So that's one of the big differences. But you know, a similar strategic focus within the United States on one defining scenario, I think, is emerging and really driving a lot of the debate here. The other thing I'll say, and this may be controversial in this group, is that I do think there is a bit of an ideological component to this competition. And I know that that makes friends in Asia, especially in Southeast Asia, a bit uncomfortable. And I don't think it's great for the United States to talk too much about that ideological competition. But I think we have to realize this is nothing like it was during the Cold War. China doesn't have a particularly attractive ideology abroad. And the United States is not at the moment trying to demonstrate that China's form of government is not going to be effective. But I think you've seen in the last couple of years, both the United States and China recognize that it is going to be very, very difficult to have this competition without having an ideological component. And both are talking more and more about why their systems are effective and successful and why they believe their systems are better in the long run. So it's a different kind of ideology than in the Cold War, but it is ideological nonetheless. And I think we'll hear more and more about that over the next few years. And it's why I very much agree with Dr. Lee's comments that, yes, we saw a little bit of an improvement in the tenor of the relationship the last few weeks between the US and China, especially with the Biden-Xi summit. But I think this is more of a short-term improvement, not a long-term one, because these structural problems are still there in the relationship. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cooper. Very insightful. Mr. John Bradford has joined us as a discussant to this session. Mr. Bradford is a senior fellow at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies, and in particular, he is attached to the Maritime Security Program. Mr. Bradford, I would like to invite you to take the floor and reflect on what has been said by the 5 panelists. And while they are still amongst in this panel, would you have any special reflections for Dr. Lee or Dr. Cooper? Please address them, after which we will turn to questions that came in for the other speakers. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much for that kind introduction and providing me the opportunity to engage with these esteemed speakers. I think that if I can start off and just look at the question, I think the speakers, especially Ambassador Bilahari, Dr. Cooper, and Professor Kureva, did a great job of explaining why this is not another Cold War. We've only had one Cold War, so it's difficult to call it a typology. But if you were to call it a typology, this really doesn't fit because it's very different. And so therefore, I think I agree with what the speakers have said, that continuing to use those words create intellectual traps where we may have false analogies and intellectual biases. But the second part of the kind of question, and I think it's actually the more interesting one, is how lessons of the Cold War can help us understand and develop better rules and mechanisms. And I think this is important because in many ways, the later parts of the Cold War were relatively well managed by rules and mechanisms. But I'm a bit more pessimistic in this case. So, I mean, if you look at rules, UNCLOS was developed during the Cold War. It is a product of the Cold War. And China agreed to UNCLOS. But as speakers throughout today's panels have shown, in many ways, China is not following those rules. It's disregarded the decisions of the 2016 tribunal. At the moment, it continues to harass the gas development programs of Malaysia and Indonesia. It's a bit ambiguous, but it seems that the new maritime traffic safety laws, domestic legislation that restricts freedom of navigation in the South China Sea in some level. And I'm sure that Chinese speakers, delegates to this conference would point out that they believe those rules are unfair, or they might point at violations that other states make. But what that tells us is that the rules made during the Cold War exist and are helping, but are not being universally followed. I think the mechanism side, crisis management mechanisms, is also very interesting. The common history that we commonly understand about the Cold War is that when the Soviet Navy was on the rise and the United States Navy on the decline in the late 70s, it was Russia that initiated a demand to create INCSI and other mechanisms. In the late 90s, when the Chinese Navy, although not nearly as strong as it is today, started to reemerge, it came and asked for an INCSI. It started the requests that led to 1998's development of the MMCA. Yet MMCA isn't really working. If you just look at 2020, the U.S. Military counted 9 incidents of unsafe and unprofessional behavior in March through May 2020 alone. And then the United States says that China is not being faithful to the agreement by not going to the December 2020 MMCA agreement. So again, maybe MMCA is not the right fit, but clearly it's not working. And I give a third example, which would be CUES. And the CUES is a post-Cold War development, but it follows a similar trajectory. CUES was an Australian initiative developed in 1999 under French leadership. It went into a full draft by 2004, and it was never fully implemented, although it was endorsed because largely of Chinese restrictions or objections. By 2014, China showed the leadership to turn CUES into a, while not binding, much more authoritative document. Yet, despite CUES, we still have incidents at sea in this region. So I'm fairly pessimistic that new rules or new mechanisms are going to solve this. If they are, they need not to be drawn from the Cold War, but from our current reality. And I think this is where the panels brought the most to the argument. Professor Kureva did a great job of describing the various different coalitions and alignments which are developing. I thought Professor Liu did a good job of talking about how those alignments and coalitions, especially ASEAN, could better leverage their intrinsic strengths to manage crises and develop a more rules-based order. I would also refer to her previous works on the role of non-state and sub-state actors. I think that's invaluable because I think that what we've seen so far is that when states are in control of the situation, they control escalation and de-escalation. We've seen that in the last 15, 20 years, but their problems are encountered when they're hemmed in by non-state actors. And then the last sentence, because I don't want to take too much time, is I just think Dr. Lee did a great job of talking about the value that additional players bring as they stake their interest in the South China Sea. And the question I'd have to everyone, perhaps the folks that are leaving first, is, are there any concerns about the growing internationalization of the South China Sea issue, the growing involvement in statements that are being made by European powers, by Korea, et cetera?
Thank you very much, Mr. Bradford, for this reflection on what the panelists brought into the discussion, and also sharing your own perspectives on the current state of play. We just saw a very kind message of Dr. Lee to all of us that he had to leave the session. Thank you very much, Dr. Lee, for joining us today. We will let you know that it was much appreciated after the session. Mr. Cooper, is there anything that you would like to share before you need to leave?
No, I would just say one final thing. I think the remarks that the panelists have made and that John Bradford made have been exactly right and very insightful. And I would just add, I think one thing that we haven't talked about, but what is really important, is that the Cold War was largely bipolar. And we're just not in a bipolar world anymore, right? As a basic starting point, we are in a multipolar world. I don't even think we know exactly how many poles there are, right? I mean, we could have a discussion on this panel about, whether Europe as a whole counts as a pole, whether Russia counts as a pole, whether India counts as a pole. I think that would be a very fruitful discussion. But the point stands that at the end of the day, we don't actually have two blocs aligned against each other. We have a much more varied set of countries with very different interests and characteristics. And so I think that richness has really come out in the panel, and I'm very happy to have been able to be here. And I'm sorry that I have to leave early.
No problem at all. It was great to have you. And I think apart from reflecting on what was said during this panel, you also made a very interesting suggestion for a new dialogue. So I look at Mr. Sun and his colleagues of the DAV to take that on board for the next time to discuss the current landscape of the world that is not bipolar, but multipolar. And the question is, how many poles are there actually? So that's for next time. Now I would like to give the floor back to Dr. Anna Kureva. You have a question from Woho Hang An. Hang An, I think it is. In recent years, Russia-Chinese relations are getting warmer. Deepening ties means Russia should take on a supporting stance for China in the South China Sea. Could this thus affect Russia's approach to South China Sea disputes? Dr. Anna, are you able to briefly reflect on that?
Yeah, thank you so much. This is a great question indeed. Of course, we can clearly see that Russia-China security relations have been on the rise, and there has been increasing military cooperation between the two. However, I would say that Russia still strives to maintain autonomous decision-making and also to diversify its relations with Asian partners. And here for the South China Sea specifically, one of the basic elements of Russia's position has been supporting international law and UNCLOS in terms of resolving the disputes in the South China Sea. And also Russia has been arguing for negotiating a code of conduct, a meaningful one. And also we can see that these statements on the role of UNCLOS and international law, they actually are included in all declarations between Russia and Asean and Russia-Viet Nam for that matter. So I guess here Russia still would like to take a neutral stance. And also it's not really likely that Russia would, for example, acknowledge officially the 9-dash line or really adhere to China's policy. So I guess it's still to maintain its neutrality and argue for a peaceful resolution of the dispute according to the international law. And also it supports the freedom of navigation over flight, as also has been mentioned in many Russia-ASEAN declarations.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anna. I said at the beginning of this session that apart from being your moderator, I'm also obliged to be your time manager, and it is time. We had a lot of food for thought, and I think the DAV has now prepared actual food to re-energize us or energize us for this afternoon's sessions that will be chaired by the Ambassador of Australia and the Ambassador of Singapore, and that will be undoubtedly very, very interesting. Thank you very, very much for your active participation, audience, the ones here at the DAV, but also the audiences online. And esteemed panelists, I also said time will probably be too short to do you justice, but I think you really give us a good insight on your line of thinking and your insights, and we will make sure that we read up your researches, and we hope that we will be able to meet you again in the future for further discussion and dialogue. Thank you all very much. Sin Kaman.
Thank you, Her Excellencies Ambassador Elsbeth Ackerman. Thank you, Dr. Viet Nam Dương. And our morning sessions have been wrapped, and the lunch is now readily served on the first floor, Building M. So this building, so please go to the